The sun sets behind the dry, unforgiving hills of East Texas, casting elongated shadows across the crumbling homesteads. On a night in 1854, neighbors whispered of a family that seemed off. 7 daughters had vanished into the darkness of their own home, yet no one dared knock at the door. Windows remained shuttered, and the faint glow of candlelight flickered through the cracks. Something unholy lingered within those walls, an unspeakable secret that even the town's preacher would avoid mentioning. By dawn the girls returned, silent, their eyes hollow, bearing a quiet fear that refused explanation. No one saw them leave, no one saw them come, but those who crossed the threshold noticed a subtle putrid scent, like decay hidden beneath freshly laundered linen. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the father, a man whose charm could disarm suspicion, yet whose stare chilled the marrow of the bravest souls. This is a story of innocence betrayed, of a corruption so deep it seeped into the very wood of the house. And though the records have long since rotted, the shadows of that family linger, a warning that some truths were never meant to be unearthed. Tonight we explore the hidden corridors of Texas' darkest legend, a father who defied morality and humanity in ways history dared not remember. His name was Ezekiel Whitmore, a man of quiet authority, whose reputation in local churches and trading posts was untarnished. To the outside world he was a pillar, pious, industrious, and strangely charismatic. Yet behind closed doors Ezekiel's demeanor twisted, an inner void that could not be contained. 7 daughters, ranging in age from 12 to 20, lived under the oppressive geometry of his rules that dictated prayer times, chores, and disturbingly, curfews that none could question. In the dim corners of the house, servants whispered of late-night noises, groans, footsteps, and sometimes the sound of women crying softly, as though begging for mercy in a tongue no one understood. In a region still scarred by the Civil War, rumors of tragedy were common, but Ezekiel's household inspired a peculiar dread, one that no military history could explain. The townspeople felt it, an invisible pressure in the air as though the land itself recoiled from the family. Some claimed the soil in the backyard seemed perpetually damp, though droughts came and went. The local priest occasionally passed by, mumbling blessings, but he never entered the house. Something within Ezekiel's walls resisted the gaze of God himself. He was meticulous, calculating, and in a town built on gossip, Ezekiel thrived in silence, where fear had replaced love and obedience had become an instrument of horror. Neighbors began noticing a pattern in the Whitmore household. The girls never laughed in public, and their voices were soft, almost reverent, like whispers in a tomb. Townsfolk speculated endlessly, attributing the eerie behavior to strict religious devotion, or to the oppressive Texas heat, which could bend even the strongest spirits. Yet children playing nearby would report seeing the daughters staring from behind curtains, their eyes unblinking, hollowed by a trauma that no parent should inflict. Rumors mutated into lore. Some spoke of the father's obsession with purity, others hinted at an occult fascination. Local authorities, limited and timid, did nothing. Small towns of the 1850s operated on appearances, where the facade of decency could conceal the vilest acts. As the weeks turned into months, the daughters' bodies began to change, though no one dared ask how. The whispers behind closed doors intensified, spreading through the town like a pestilence. Merchants, preachers, and wandering doctors shared tales of muffled screams and strange deliveries of food in the dead of night. Yet no tangible proof emerged. The town had become a theater of suspended fear, where suspicion was powerless and horror existed only in the spaces between words. Even the wind seemed to avoid the Whitmore homestead, carrying away nothing but the faintest sighs of those trapped within. The mother, Margaret Whitmore, was a ghost in the household. Whether she had died years prior or had been driven away by Ezekiel's escalating madness, no one could say. Occasionally, townspeople claimed to see her walking the back pasture, her face obscured by a shawl, lips moving as if chanting forbidden prayers. The daughters spoke of her rarely, and when they did, their tone was reverent yet terrified. In the absence of maternal protection, Ezekiel's control grew absolute. The house became a microcosm of fear, a laboratory of corruption, where obedience was enforced through threats and subtle, invisible violence. Nights were worst. The flicker of candlelight revealed walls scrawled with cryptic marks, floors polished until they reflected distorted images of those who dared enter. The eldest daughter whispered of dreams she could not explain, dreams where her father loomed over her like a shadow without substance, where every corner of the house was a trap, and escape was a fantasy. Each girl carried her own secret, a piece of the house's hidden horror, but they could never share it. The act of speech itself seemed dangerous, a trespass on an unspoken covenant of fear. The town, blissfully ignorant or willfully blind, continued its routines, leaving the Whitmore house to the shadows that thrived within. Ezekiel's methods were systematic, almost ceremonial. Each day began with prayers recited in exacting tone, followed by labor that tested the body and mind. The daughters were watched constantly, their movements monitored for deviation from the father's strict patterns. Punishments were subtle but effective. Meals delayed, rooms plunged into darkness, or assignments repeated endlessly until exhaustion made compliance inevitable. The girls learned early that resistance invited horror. At night, Ezekiel moved among them silently, his presence a living threat. Doors creaked under his weight, and the house's walls seemed to pulse with his authority. Neighbors spoke of a certain unease, as if the Whitmore homestead emitted a low-frequency vibration that unsettled animals and humans alike. One livestock trader recalled horses shying uncontrollably as they passed the property line, as if the ground itself rejected the presence of life. Such tales, while dismissed by rational minds, became the foundation of a myth surrounding the family. A myth that rendered the Whitmores untouchable in the collective imagination of the town. Within the house, obedience was a language and fear its grammar. Ezekiel's shadow stretched long and cold, shaping the daughters' lives into a narrative of suffering no historian would ever record. Whispers suggested Ezekiel's influence extended beyond his homestead. Nearby, a small decaying orphanage operated under the guise of Christian charity, a place where children disappeared quietly, swallowed by bureaucratic indifference. Some claimed the Whitmore daughters were modeled after these orphans, obedient, silent, and molded to suit a father's obsession. Clergy visited the household sporadically, praising Ezekiel's devotion, but they never questioned the absence of maternal guidance, or the pallor of 7 young girls whose smiles had long been stolen. Letters sent from the orphanage hinted at an unnatural mentorship. The children were taught precision, discipline, and silence as virtues above all else. Ezekiel had mastered the art of control. His authority was surgical, and the world outside the homestead remained oblivious. When neighbors encountered the daughters in town, they were perfectly mannered, their posture impeccable, their speech careful. Yet a strange cadence lingered in their eyes, a tremor that spoke of nights spent in shadows, of laughter stifled, of horrors internalized. The orphanage, like the Whitmore home, became part of a hidden network of discipline and domination, a mirror reflecting the patriarch's darkest impulses. Those who attempted inquiry, clergy, teachers, wandering traders, either left quietly or avoided the house altogether, their instincts warning them of a corruption beyond their comprehension. The first daughter, barely 16, began exhibiting subtle changes, fatigue, nausea, an inability to explain the hollowness she felt inside. By town gossip standards, these were signs of natural growth, but the truth was far more sinister. Within months, each daughter, one by one, became pregnant. The town, bound by ignorance and fear of scandal, said nothing. Any questions were deflected by Ezekiel's charm and pious reputation. The daughters themselves could not speak, trapped in a labyrinth of obedience and terror. Each pregnancy was a mark of unthinkable violation, a testament to a father's complete dominion over flesh and will. The pregnancies were carried in secret, hidden from neighbors and clerics alike. Nights were haunted by muted cries, the creaking of floorboards and the whispers of daughters consoling one another in tones too soft to hear. Ezekiel's authority had transcended ordinary cruelty. It had become a ritualized exercise of domination, one that defied the very fabric of human morality. Even as the pregnancies became physically undeniable, the town's moral compass faltered. Ezekiel's sermons, full of fire and righteous indignation, kept suspicion at bay. The daughters were seen walking with stoic composure, their bellies concealed beneath layers of skirts and shawls. Gossip bubbled quietly, but no formal complaint emerged. Fear, curiosity, and reverence had merged into complicity. Teachers and neighbors whispered privately, but public acknowledgement was impossible. The father's charisma and perceived holiness rendered him untouchable. This was a microcosm of 19th century societal blindness. Appearances mattered more than truth, and spiritual authority often shielded the most grotesque corruption. By the time the truth could no longer be ignored, it had festered for months, leaving the town's conscience hollow and ineffective. Within the Whitmore walls, nights were long and unbearable. The daughters huddled together in the attic, speaking in whispers that only echoed against the exposed beams. Each had her own torment, fear of discovery, confusion over their own bodies, and guilt imposed by the manipulations of a father who wielded sin and salvation interchangeably. The house itself seemed complicit, every shadow a witness, every floorboard a recorder of forbidden acts. Servants avoided the attic entirely, citing creaks that sounded like human wails. The daughters' growing pregnancies brought new horrors: pain, isolation, and Ezekiel's unwavering control. Sleep offered no respite. Dreams carried them into twisted landscapes, forests where trees bled, rivers that flowed backward, and their father's face everywhere, omnipresent, omniscient. The psychological trauma compounded the physical violation, leaving the girls trapped in a cycle of fear from which escape seemed impossible. One crisp morning, a wandering preacher named Josiah Harper arrived in the town, carrying an air of subtle determination. Unlike the local clergy, Josiah was not easily impressed by sermons or outward piety. He noticed the daughters' hollow expressions and the way Ezekiel's presence distorted every interaction. There was a subtle tension, a quiet hum of dread emanating from the Whitmore property, and Josiah's instincts told him something was horribly wrong. Attempting casual conversation, he probed for clues, only to be met with polite, rehearsed responses. At night, he lingered outside the homestead, listening. The faint whispers of suppressed terror reached his ears, muffled cries, quiet sobbing, and a rhythm of life entirely dictated by fear. This stranger's arrival marked a turning point, an observer who could not be easily deceived. Yet even Josiah could not anticipate the depth of corruption that awaited him behind the house's closed doors, nor the ancient patterns of trauma embedded in the family's walls. The descent into horror was just beginning. Josiah's curiosity turned to dread as he learned more about the household. Servants whispered in corners, their eyes darting nervously whenever Ezekiel's shadow approached. They spoke of rooms never entered by anyone except the father, where candlelight danced across walls like living fingers. Some said they had heard screams muffled by quilts, the sound of despair so acute it seemed to linger long after it had ceased. Each daughter bore a private horror, their pain compounded by the impossibility of confession. Ezekiel monitored them meticulously, noting the smallest deviation in behavior, every shift in posture, every faltering step. Discipline had become art and terror its canvas. Even Josiah, a man hardened by years of ministry in unsettled towns, felt the unnatural weight of the house pressing down, a stifling presence that seemed almost sentient. He understood then that no casual observation could save these girls. The corruption had roots that twisted through every timber of the home, embedding itself in the daughters' minds as surely as it had in their bodies. Late one night, Josiah stumbled upon a loose floorboard in a neglected hallway. Beneath it lay a narrow passage so dark it seemed to devour light. Drawn by a mixture of terror and necessity, he squeezed through and discovered a hidden chamber. Inside were remnants of rituals, candles burned to stubs, strange symbols etched into the wood, and a series of journals that chronicled Ezekiel's daily exertion of control. The entries were clinical, void of emotion, detailing the daughters' lives as one might record livestock or crops. Fear, hope, or humanity did not exist in these pages. Each word was a testament to the father's meticulous obsession, and Josiah felt a chill as he realized the full extent of the horror. This was not merely abuse. It was a calculated, systematic domination, designed to imprint trauma across bodies and minds. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with memory, as if they had absorbed years of suffering and were now whispering them back. The daughters' psychological states deteriorated rapidly. The eldest became mute. The middle two wandered the house as if in trance, and the youngest huddled in corners, rocking silently. The pregnancies, coupled with relentless fear, created a labyrinth of confusion, shame, and despair. Each girl struggled to retain a fragment of identity, but Ezekiel's shadow suffocated even the smallest spark of autonomy. They whispered to each other in code, fragments of resistance hidden in half-formed sentences, yet the weight of fatherly authority rendered them compliant, their rebellion buried under layers of terror. Josiah, witnessing these fractured minds, felt a mounting urgency, but also an oppressive hopelessness. The corruption was not simply physical. It was psychological, an invisible web that ensnared thought, perception, and memory. He began recording what he saw, knowing the town would never accept it without proof. But proof itself seemed impossible to obtain without entering the father's dominion fully, and surviving. Ezekiel's cruelty was not limited to control, but extended to concealment. Pregnancies were hidden with expert precision. Cloaks and dresses were layered, rooms cleaned obsessively, and servants silenced through fear and subtle intimidation. Neighbors, if they glimpsed the changes, were quick to rationalize them as illness or puberty. No doctor was ever allowed within the walls. The father's reputation as a pious man insulated him from suspicion, while the daughters were trained to behave as if nothing unusual existed. Every ritual of concealment reinforced obedience, teaching the girls that survival demanded complicity. Each night Ezekiel inspected their rooms, ensuring no secret could escape. Candles burned low, shadows danced across walls, and the girls learned to move silently, breathe quietly, and hide the evidence of their suffering. The house itself had become a weapon. Floors squeaked at random, walls carried sound selectively, and every corridor funneled attention back to the father. Escape was impossible, not only because of the land and distance, but because fear had become a cage within their own minds. One morning, the eldest daughter, Anne, attempted to flee. She waited until Ezekiel was distracted, slipped through a loose board in the floor, and ran toward the woods that bordered the property. Heart pounding, lungs burning, she reached the tree line before feeling the father's presence, not in sight, but in the air, a weight pressing down, a suffocating inevitability. Panic forced her back. The house loomed larger than ever. Josiah, observing from a distance, saw her return, trembling, her spirit bent but unbroken. This fleeting attempt at freedom revealed a crucial truth. The terror was not merely external but had been internalized, encoded into every muscle, every thought. The father's dominion extended beyond doors and walls. It inhabited the daughters' minds. Escape required more than physical movement. It demanded the undoing of psychological imprisonment. Josiah realized that to save them, he would need to confront both the father and the intangible horror that had taken root in the hearts of the daughters, a horror cultivated over years with meticulous cruelty. Josiah began documenting every detail, every oddity in the Whitmore household. He spoke to neighbors, piecing together fragments of observation, strange deliveries at night, children appearing suddenly ill, women avoiding the family entirely. Each account deepened his understanding of Ezekiel's calculated dominion. Yet the further he delved, the more palpable the weight of dread became. The house seemed aware of his presence, each creaking floorboard a warning. Shadows twisted unnaturally under moonlight, stretching toward him like living tendrils. The daughters, sensing Josiah's intent, oscillated between hope and terror. They whispered carefully, their words fragments of a hidden world too dangerous to fully reveal. Josiah's notes grew into a ledger of horror, chronicling violations that the town could never imagine. Yet he knew words alone would not save the girls. Action was necessary. To intervene meant crossing a threshold into the father's dominion, a territory where human morality was irrelevant and fear was absolute. While exploring the house at night, Josiah discovered another journal, this one belonging to one of the daughters. Its pages were filled with trembling script recounting a world of pain, fear, and impossible obedience. She wrote of Ezekiel's nightly inspections, of whispered threats disguised as lessons, and of the pregnancies that no one outside could understand. The diary revealed a psychological landscape as harrowing as the physical violations. Dreams of running, of screaming, of disappearing into a void, only to be pulled back into the house by invisible chains. Every line radiated despair, yet also resilience, the faintest ember of defiance. Josiah read in silence, feeling the weight of the words pressing against his own chest. This diary was more than testimony. It was proof of a horror the town refused to see. A map of trauma that could guide him toward liberation if he had the courage to act. Ezekiel's control extended beyond discipline. It had taken on the cadence of ritual. Each day he administered exercises of obedience cloaked in piety. Meals, prayers, and chores followed an unyielding pattern, designed to strip individuality from the daughters. Even minor infractions were punished subtly. A glance too long, a misstep, a whispered word. Ezekiel's methods were surgical, erasing autonomy while maintaining a facade of care. The house itself became complicit. Every corridor funneled attention, every door creaked to manipulate movement, and every shadow reinforced authority. His voice, calm and measured, carried a hypnotic weight that bent perception, making fear an internalized constant. The daughters learned quickly that survival meant inhabiting a world of half-truths, silence, and careful navigation. In these rituals, horror was normalized, encoded into the very fabric of their daily lives. Despite years of oppression, faint signs of resistance emerged. The daughters began leaving subtle marks, tiny scratches on walls, notes written in hidden corners, symbols in their laundry folds that hinted at secret communications. One night, Anne whispered a plan to the others, a coordinated attempt to signal Josiah to indicate the precise moments when Ezekiel's gaze was elsewhere. Fear mingled with determination. The girls understood that defiance carried immense risk, yet remaining passive guaranteed continued violation. Josiah, sensing these signals, began formulating a plan. The terror that bound them could be turned, however delicately, into an instrument of liberation. The house seemed to notice, its creaking floors and shifting shadows responding to the smallest act of rebellion. Each mark, each whispered signal, was a spark in the darkness, a faint glimmer of hope against an almost absolute dominion. Section 20. The Night of Confrontation. The night chosen for confrontation arrived silently, cloaked in thick fog that blanketed the homestead. Josiah approached with caution, carrying the knowledge of the daughter's signals. Every step toward the house was heavy with dread. The air itself seemed to resist his presence. Inside, the daughters moved silently, hearts pounding, coordinating in the shadows as if the walls themselves could betray them. Ezekiel, unaware of the approaching threat, moved through his nightly rituals with a sense of omnipotence, unaware that his carefully constructed dominion was about to face its first true challenge. The house was alive with tension, every creak and flicker of candlelight magnified. For the first time in years, fear was no longer unilateral. The oppressive presence that had dominated the Whitmore daughters now faced an outside force that refused to yield. The stage was set for a confrontation that would unearth horrors buried for decades and challenge the very limits of human endurance and morality. Ezekiel sensed the disturbance before he saw Josiah. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and a chill crept through the house as if the walls themselves recoiled. His authority, once absolute, faltered in the presence of an outsider willing to pierce the veil of obedience. Anger twisted his calm features into something almost monstrous, and he moved through the house like a predator, eyes sharp, voice low but cutting, every word a threat. The daughters froze, caught between terror and the plan they had risked everything to execute. Josiah confronted Ezekiel directly, exposing fragments of his crimes, yet the father's denial was flawless, practiced over decades. The confrontation became a psychological battle, a test of wills where fear itself was weaponized. Shadows flickered against the walls, and the house seemed to vibrate with tension, echoing years of suppressed suffering. Every creak, every muted gasp, reinforced the intensity of the moment, the absolute confrontation between dominion and defiance. Using the signals carefully left by the daughters, Josiah guided them toward safety. Anne led the way, silently opening hidden passages while Ezekiel's attention was momentarily distracted. Each daughter's pulse raced as the father's presence lingered, almost palpable in every breath. The hidden chamber, the floors, the walls, all became accomplices in their desperate flight. Fear was both a cage and a compass, guiding each step, heightening every sense. Josiah's calm voice offered direction, reassurance, but even he could feel the lingering psychological chains that Ezekiel had imposed. It took hours of meticulous navigation, but finally the daughters emerged from the oppressive shadows into the cool night air. For the first time in years, the weight of constant surveillance lifted, and a fragile, trembling hope began to take root. When the daughters' absence, or rather, their emergence from captivity, became known, the town reacted with a mixture of disbelief, horror, and denial. The Whitmore homestead, long a source of unspoken dread, was finally inspected. Authorities discovered remnants of the father's meticulous rituals, journals, symbols, and evidence of pregnancies long hidden from prying eyes. Yet even with proof, societal fear and reverence for religious authority complicated justice. Ezekiel remained defiant, claiming divine purpose, while the daughters struggled to reclaim identities long fractured by trauma. The town, caught between moral outrage and disbelief, slowly began to confront the fact that the horror had been present all along, invisible only because no one dared look. The legacy of fear had left permanent scars, both in the daughters and in the collective consciousness of the community. Even after Ezekiel was removed from power, the house retained its oppressive aura. Daughters struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and fragmented memories. Their bodies and minds bore the imprints of years of domination, the psychological trauma of forced pregnancies, and the memory of a father whose authority had seemed absolute. The land itself carried whispers. Children born and raised after the incident reported strange sounds, shadows that moved independently, and an uncanny stillness that suggested memory had been embedded in wood and soil. The story, officially recorded in fragments, faded into obscurity, remembered only in hushed whispers among historians and folklorists who stumbled across the town's archives. Yet the horror persisted. Trauma had been imprinted across generations, a reminder that some evils do not end when the perpetrator is gone. The Whitmore case became legend and myth, its details suppressed by fear, shame, and religious authority. Those who study the events speak cautiously, aware that the story is more than historical record. It is a meditation on human corruption, the fragility of innocence, and the power of fear to silence entire communities. The daughters' resilience is remarkable, yet the horror they endured remains embedded in every whispered account. The house still stands, abandoned, a silent monument to decades of unthinkable acts. Wind passes through broken windows carrying faint echoes of screams, lullabies, and whispered prayers. Scholars, wandering preachers, and curious souls have passed through, sensing the weight of trauma, but few can comprehend the totality of the corruption that once reigned. The story reminds us that evil often wears a mask of piety, and that some truths are so deeply buried only the brave or the damned will ever uncover them. The Whitmore legacy endures as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the darkest acts of humanity often occur in plain sight, hidden in the shadows of trust, family, and faith.